Hello everyone. Fire Emblem on the 3DS. We have 3 games and a lot to talk about. It will be just me talking today since I do not have any recorded footage from the 3DS of my own. We had the wonderful Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon on the Nintendo DS. However, I'm not looking at that today, maybe another time. It's purely 3DS today. So 3 games, and I think it'll be best to go in order of release date. Makes the most sense, I think. I can honestly say that I have never played a bad Fire Emblem game. And of course I'm restricted to just the ones that have been published in the West. So we know there is a fair contingent of Fire Emblem games which remain Japan only to this day, sadly. But what we have is amazingly good. And I think the 3 games on the 3DS do not disappoint. It's only natural that in my preference, I veer more towards maybe one game than the other, and I will explain why, to my mind, there are 2 games on the 3DS that are right up there in terms of quality and enjoyment, and one game that falters a bit, in my opinion, and I will explain that as well. So let's start off with the game that kicked off the revival of the Fire Emblem series, especially in the West. You've probably heard the story many times before, so I'll just very briefly summarise that Fire Emblem sales had been declining for years, and there were serious thoughts about shutting down the series. However, the team at Intelligent Systems were given a final chance to make one more Fire Emblem game, and that would decide the future. If it did not reach the threshold of 250,000 units sold, it would be considered a failure, and that would be the end of Fire Emblem. Well, the team set to work and decided that they would incorporate elements from all the previous Fire Emblem games to make a completely new one. Now that sounds like it could end up potentially messy, but I think they pulled it off. Fire Emblem Awakening is a stupendous achievement, especially considering that the 3DS had only been released the year before, so in 2011. The game Fire Emblem Awakening came out in Japan in 2012, so just a year later. They'd obviously been working longer than a year on it, so they had to work with what was a new, anticipated platform, which is obviously pretty difficult. I remember buying the game quite soon after release when I started it up and entered into the usual Fire Emblem combat on the grid base. You enter your commands and then the action is carried out visually. And I don't know what I had been expecting, but I was so gobsmacked. I think my jaw just dropped and I gave a sort of cry, and Poodle Pa was quite alarmed and said, "Is something wrong with the game?" And I said, "No, it's just so amazing." I still see it in my mind's eye. The animation just took my breath away. To see that on the 3DS was just mind-blowing. It really brought something special to the gameplay. I replayed that particular fight and that particular scene probably half a dozen times, just drinking it all in. Such was the effect of the new console, the 3DS, and the new game. Now, normally I would expect to be able to say, and I played the game and I finished it, and that would have been roughly 10 years ago, so I probably can't remember very much. But as fate would play it, I was enjoying the game. I was probably enjoying it too much, and I got worried that I would be racing through it. So I put it down one day, and of course, a dozen other games immediately sprang to my attention, and I got sidetracked, and for some odd reason I can't remember, I did not return to the game until 2020. And I know that because it's documented on Twitter. I restarted the game since I couldn't remember very much anymore, and I documented my gameplay via screenshot photos and commentary, running little series on Twitter. And that was just a heap of fun because I was able to share it with other people, and I was just amazed at the number of people who were obvious fans of Awakening and were simply enjoying just seeing another person go through the game and reliving moments of it together. That was a shared experience that I value very highly. So I played Awakening in September, October of that year, and you can still find my entries about it on Twitter. Awakening was a big success, fortunately, and thus guaranteed the future of the Fire Emblem franchise. So Intelligent Systems started work on a new Fire Emblem game for the 3DS, and that was released in 2015 in Japan and a year later in the West. And that is, of course, called Fates, which I will look at as well. For me, there are always two main pillars where a game has to perform well: the story and the gameplay. If one department is weak, that will drag down the other one as well, especially in JRPGs and especially in games like this. These two pillars have to work together.
You can't have one without the other.
Because the tight-knit unit of characters you have who need to have a good dynamic between them as characters to be convincing and engaging, and their story has to resonate. That has to be replicated on the field of battle, where they need to work together well, and you need to do your job, of course, of, improving your units and being a good tactician in how you conduct the battles.
When paired up, the lead unit's abilities will be greatly enhanced during battle. As they fight together, their bond will strengthen. The stronger the relationship, the more advantage they gain in battle.
So for me, there always has to be this synergy between these two elements. A Fire Emblem for me is a series where this approach really shines. And Fire Emblem Awakening simply does it incredibly well. The story is good and even fascinating in parts, and raises some interesting questions about things like personality and selfhood, and the battles are reliable, interesting maps that you have to puzzle out. I don't remember any particular weakness when playing Awakening. I just had a good time all round, and everything just seemed to work together really well. Awakening didn't just use elements from older previous games, it also introduced some new ones. For instance, they introduced something called paralogs, and I absolutely loved those, and I'm really happy they carried on using them in future games as well. Now, paralogs are sort of optional chapters. You got to reach a certain point and level to be able to do them. And then they provide you with a variety of features like new story background, but also special items or skills you might get, even recruitable characters. So I always do all the paralogs. You don't have to, but if you love Fire Emblem and you want to get the most out of the game, I think most people will play them. Another feature they introduced was the barracks. It's really quite a modest feature, I would say. You get some mini events happening there, and you can choose a bit of your own decor and look at details in the profile, so a bit tame overall. But you can see the seeds of an idea that we will look at once we get to the next game, Fates. Now, the really, really big new thing in Awakening is the type of relationship system they introduced. It's not the first time Fire Emblem had one. I believe it was also used in Genealogy of the Holy War. But they certainly did it differently in Awakening, and once again they must have hit a sweet spot, because that system of relationship building and romance was also carried forward to future games with great success. So we're talking, of course, about what is known in the online vernacular as shipping characters. You can reach S rank with certain characters, older games only opposite gender, and you can get married and have children. And those children can also be used in your party setup. So there is a lot of incentive to try and get that high relationship level and the benefits of marriage. So we see this system pretty much as it was introduced in Awakening, also in Fire Emblem Fates, and then later on even in Three Houses on the Switch. Unfortunately, Awakening does not have support for using Amiibo, but later there were some characters produced as separate Amiibo to be used in other games. Of course, most Amiibo were made for the Smash Brothers series, but you can also use them in many other games, including other Fire Emblem games. And I have certainly taken advantage of that. So for Awakening, we have Crom.
Although he is the prince of the Halidom of Elise, Crom also leads the shepherds.
Lucina and Robin, who is the player character in Awakening. I play every Fire Emblem game at least 100 hours. I don't think I've ever done it below that. It is such a grand adventure. Exactly the sort of thing I look for in a JRPG. Tactics games are probably, together with dungeon crawlers, my favourite subgenre. I'm glad the team decided to stick with the traditional medieval-inspired environments and theme from the original Fire Emblem games. It just suits it so well. That's just a Fire Emblem vibe that I enjoy. One thing in particular I like about the story, and I'll have to be a bit general and vague here to try and not give away anything, and that is the technique of storytelling, which sort of goes in a great big arc. And we have what in fiction is usually referred to as a circular ending. No, you don't end up at exactly the same place as you were in the beginning, no, but it sort of gives you that kind of circular closure that is very satisfying for a reader or someone watching a movie, or in this case playing a game. It opens up new perspectives on everything that has happened, and I took a few notes at the time about this, and in particular about the time travel element that is contained in the Awakening story. And you know me and time travel, so that really worked for me. So there's a specific reference in the game to future and past selves, and that's why I mentioned selfhood earlier. So this raises some profound questions about the kind of person that you think you might become, or you think you were in the past, and it encourages reflection but also forward-looking. So we have many choices throughout our lives, and sometimes it feels like if you take a decision, you will go down one road rather than another. And accordingly, your life will be different, and you might become a different person. So there's the possibility of several different personalities in one lifetime. And that can be a frightening thought, but also an energizing one. And I always have special appreciation for any game that makes us think about who we were, who we are, and who we might be in the future. It introduces a depth that makes it emotionally and intellectually much more satisfying to play the game. It's just my opinion. You don't have to see it like that, and you can just enjoy the game as is. But I like these aspects of storytelling. So let us now go on to the next game that followed Awakening. I'd already mentioned Fire Emblem Fates, and this is the limited edition. And it contains a steel book. And I found my old docket in there from EB Games. 22nd of May 2016. I paid a total of 160 New Zealand dollars. So a very nice steel book. Also a poster, which is hanging on our wall in the hallway. I'll just pop in a photo. The game itself in its standard case, a small but very nice art book with a lot of detail. And this is the sort of stuff I like to inspect closely, weapons, etc., character design sketches, and the actual final artwork. Now, the important thing about this edition is that it combines all three games on one cartridge. Whoa! What's all that about? You probably know, but in case you don't, I'll just explain very briefly. For some reason, Intelligent Systems went the Pokemon route with this game. They decided to have not one, not two, but three games altogether forming Fire Emblem Fates. In fact, I would say it's not three games, but 2.5. That's what I always say, because the final one, the third one, certainly is not of the same size and scope as the other two. I will pop in the pictures of the regular retail editions that you're probably familiar with for Fire Emblem Fates Birthright, Conquest, and the final one is Revelation, and was only ever made available as a digital download. I don't think many people thought at the time it was a good idea, and I think with hindsight we still think it wasn't a good idea. Maybe they had wanted to do too much, especially after the success of Awakening. Maybe they thought, here is our opportunity, we can really go to town and, it'll sell XYZ copies. I don't know. I look at it from the point of view, does it work? The problem with this tripartite approach is that you don't know how many people are going to play all 3 games and how many are just going to play maybe one. They are supposedly standalone, so you can choose to play just Birthright or Conquest, but there has to be obviously an overarching construction to make it all meaningful as a 3-parter. I honestly think that you're only gonna really understand the full story of Fates if you play all 3 games. That's what I did, and I'm glad I did, but I will talk about that journey in a moment. Do I recommend that people play all 3 games and go to the huge trouble of trying to get hold of them, especially nowadays? I actually don't. I played Birthright first in 2016 when I got it. Then I thought, I can't wait to get on to the second one, Conquest. And I started it up, and my eyes were just glazing over, and I thought, well, what's happening? This is Fire Emblem. I should just be gobbling it up. But in fact, I felt like I had severe burnout. Okay, I thought, danger, step back. And I decided to leave it, put it aside, and come back after a really good lapse of time. In fact, I did not return to Fates until 5 years later. Yeah, it took me that long. I know this because I documented my final playthrough as I got to the end of the game on Twitter again, towards the end of 2021, so in November, I think. I had enjoyed Birthright. It's a game that I would say has equal measure of light and dark in it to balance the story. You can see that here in the lovely faceplates for the 3DS, showing us one side of the family, the Hoshidan side, and the back plate shows us the Nohr side.
2 kingdoms at the crossroads of war, for peace in Hoshido and the glory of Nohr. At the epicenter of this conflict stands a young royal named Corrin. Will the prince side with the family that raised him in Nohr, or his true bloodline in Hoshido? Whatever he decides, he may soon find that his greatest strength lies not in the weapons he holds, but in the bonds he builds.
The Nohr side being the family side in Conquest. For me, it was, as an experience, a much darker story, very dark. I would say I enjoyed Birthright, but not quite as much as Awakening. While the maps were all fine, they lacked something, a special something that I associate with the very best Fire Emblem games. They introduced this idea of little gimmicks that you had to solve, certain types of puzzles or terrain-related issues you had to overcome, things like that, which sometimes were fun and sometimes were a bit of a nuisance, a bit tedious, But when I went on to Conquest, I honestly struggled the whole time to really like it as much as I wanted and as I had hoped. I'm normally someone who loves dark stories. You probably know that if you've watched a fair number of my videos or read my writings on the community page. I'm a sucker for really dark stuff. But it was a bit unrelenting in Conquest, and the writing felt stiff to me. I have to say, however, there's nothing like a really great baddie. You always have several antagonists in a Fire Emblem story, and one of the important ones in Conquest is called Corrin. I won't go any further into who he is. He is one of the great evil characters within Fire Emblem. Whereas I have to confess, a lot of other baddies I may only retain a vague memory of. They often sort of emerge and become a bit misty in my memory, but Garin is one whom I can call up in my memory even the way he looks immediately. So that is clearly a very strong point. And I know quite a lot of people who prefer Conquest over Birthright. It's hard to predict, if you want to make a choice. I don't know what else to say. It is compelling, and coupled with antagonist Garin is another character called Iago in the English version. And Iago you might recognise as a name from Shakespeare. Iago is of course a very sinister character in Othello. Iago reminded me of Wormtongue. I just couldn't get Wormtongue out of my mind when I played the game. And I think you can see where I'm going with this, and Garin as the declining antagonist, a man with great power, overcome by dark forces. I just had a very strong The Two Towers feeling about the whole thing. So much so that I didn't really see Conquest as a truly independent story. Yeah, it could just be me. I don't know why, and once I had it in my brain, I couldn't get Two Towers out again. But that certainly influenced how I thought about it. The other thing I have to say is, and I haven't seen anybody else mention this, but if you play both games, Birthright and Conquest, by the time I got well into Conquest, I kept groaning occasionally when looking at the maps. I shouldn't be doing that with Fire Emblem maps because they should just be brilliant, full stop. But I recognised them. I have a very good visual memory for maps and how they've designed them, no doubt because I tend to replay a lot of them. Yeah, I'm a bit finicky like that. I recognised a lot of the maps as repeat locations with hardly any variation in Conquest. That's, inevitably I felt a bit like they attempted to do a 3-game set, but it was obviously so much work, they decided to reuse certain maps. Of course, according to the storyline, it often made sense that in the second game you revisit certain locations and etc. But to have the map tactically organised in almost the same way, I don't know, I had a bit of a feeling of they were trying to lighten their workload a bit. So it just didn't leave such a good taste in my mouth, I suppose. Maybe that also influenced how I played Conquest, because a lot of people always say Birthright is the easier one and Conquest is a lot harder. I honestly didn't notice that. Not really. There may have been a slight ramping up, yes, but you'd sort of naturally expect that, wouldn't you? I think they reckoned that most people would start with Birthright. And I saw a lot of articles at the time the game was released that recommended doing that because it seems sort of like a natural playing order in a way. And Conquest being the much darker game, it leads you then into the finale, which is the third game, Revelation. I don't recall finding it significantly more difficult or anything like that. I just went through it and probably quite quickly. Once again, doing everything, all the paralogs and everything else. I didn't skimp on any of the gameplay. And then you come to the third one and you hope for a great revelation, because it's called Revelation, and it will tie everything together and you'll finally understand the whole thing. And it was a bit like that, but not really overwhelmingly so. In Revelation, you don't choose a side as you do in Birthright and Conquest.
Thus far, we've examined two sides of a brutal conflict. But what if Corrin didn't choose a side? This third path, that of revelation, illuminates many dark secrets. So Corrin should only walk it after siding with one of the two kingdoms and seeing their story unfold.
Silence!
Pulling together people from both sides of the divide, Hoshido and Nohr. Now that means, of course, you end up with a much larger cast of playable characters than you do in either Birthright or Conquest. But the game itself is quite a bit shorter. So it feels a bit like there's some wastage there because you can't possibly use all the characters in a meaningful way in combat. You just pick and choose a few and stick with those, really. The action takes place mainly in a completely new location called Valor, which is a place on a different plane, not in the same realm as the kingdoms where we previously battled it out. To be honest, it felt just a wee bit odd to me. It never had the big impact that I was expecting and hoping for. And to me, many of the maps were the least interesting in the whole game. I know there were some special, puzzles and stuff, but I wasn't that taken with it. I can't say whether I was simply worn out by that stage or my interest was dwindling. I don't know, but it just didn't feel a really strong finale to me. And that was highlighted by the final boss, the real final boss in the third part. I was expecting they'd be pulling out all the fireworks, and I prepped my troops as much as I could, and I was ready for that final boss. Oh, what a damp squib that was. I don't know how long it took me, but maybe 10 minutes at the most. I can't really remember. I only know that it was over so quickly. I sort of looked and thought, I must have missed something somewhere. I was completely confounded. So I went back and replayed the boss battle with a different party setup, a bit lower spec'd, downplayed everything a bit to make it harder, and really watching out for, could I do anything differently? No. I just breezed through it again in, 7 or 10 minutes at the most. And it was over, and that was it. Of course, there were a few things that you finally, at the end, understand about the complete universe that is Fire Emblem Fates. I think it was a mistake to go for the tripartite approach, I really do. They couldn't really give you the whole sense of what the world was about in just one game, because that would have been revealing too much. So you have a sort of limited experience in the first two games. I think the world building overall was affected by that, and it's not as cohesive as you'd hope it to be. You can see how I was struggling with wanting to like the game more than I did in the end. And I have to be honest about that. I still had a great time with it. Obviously, it's Fire Emblem, and it's not a bad game, not at all. But it's patchy in parts. I made a few notes at the time. I was playing Fates, and it's always interesting going back, isn't it? I see that my favourite class was Strategist, and my favourite weapon was the spear, javelin and spear. For what it's worth, there you are. Now, I want to end on a positive note with Fates, and there's one new feature they introduced that I liked a lot, and that is called My Castle. And that's exactly what it is. It's a bit of castle building. And they did this very cleverly. So you can do all the usual thing about upgrading your facilities and all that you know from any kind of town building type of game. So they used a Streetpass to make this all work online.
My Castle as Corrin calls it, is the home base of his army, located in a dimension separate from Hoshido and Nohr. There is no safer fortress. Here, he can prepare for the next battle, interact with allies, and occasionally defend it from unknown invaders.
Can we do this?
As Corrin and company battle and clear maps, they will accumulate Dragon Vein points, allowing them to build useful facilities around the castle. Streetpass encounters at a facility called Traveler's Plaza. Via Streetpass, Corrin can battle other warriors' teams at his castle or theirs.
And those were heaps of fun. I spent a lot more time on my castle than you'd think possible. It definitely contributed a good chunk to my playtime. And even after I'd finished the game and exhausted the DLC and everything, I still went back occasionally and just futzed around a bit with my castle. For instance, if you upgraded certain castle facilities to level 3, you could then recruit some special characters. And that was kind of cool. So yeah, the whole My Castle thing I thought was a great addition. And it didn't just feel like a sort of tacked on mini game, but it was part of the whole operation. I was surprised that it worked for me without a hitch and without any lag or disconnection or anything like that. Yeah, a great feature, I would say. As far as I'm aware, Fire Emblem Fates only had one amiibo published, and that's the one I don't have. It's Corrin. You can get either male or female Corrin, and I have no idea why I didn't get one. I'm thinking I should remedy that now. They're still available, so I can order one. But which one to get? Male or female Corrin? They both look nice. A female Corrin strikes a more expressive stance with the sword. What are your thoughts? Do you have one of the Corrins? Which one? I have played as both, either in the game, and I don't have any particular preference there, but as far as the figure is concerned, I might go with the female. What do you think? But you can use a number of amiibo in Fates to great effect.
In another world quite unlike Corrin's, people collect mysteriously powerful figures called amiibo. Some of these figures take on forms of legendary warriors, including the daring Prince Marth and Ike, famed leader of the Grail mercenaries. After tapping these amiibo figures, they will appear in Corrin's castle. Twice they will appear bearing gifts, but on the third time, they will challenge Corrin to a hero battle.
Must I fall
Should he
here?
win, the hero will join his cause.
You can use Marth, always popular, of course. You can use Robin, Lucina, and the ever-popular Ike. I also have Roy, just to complete my Amiibo collection showing, and Tiki. People often forget about her, but she is in Fire Emblem. And Fire Emblem Three Houses, of course, has Byleth, which we think is how it's supposed to be pronounced, whether it's Byleth or I'll stick with Byleth. Her hair colour is a bit odd, I think. Yeah, not quite right, I reckon. But on the whole, I think Amiibo collecting is a great way to go if you want to collect something and you want to stay within a really reasonable budget. You don't have a lot of space, they're small. All the Amiibo I've had have been nicely finished. Most of them have good colour jobs. They look just great. I'm really glad I started getting them. And it's a real bonus that you can use them in games, and they give you those little bonus extras that are just nice to have sometimes. Unfortunately, of course, the online elements of Streetpass that were incorporated into certain games, that has been closed down. I know I got Marth, definitely. They're not as overpowering as you might expect, so I didn't end up using him a lot, but it was just cool having him around. So let's go to the final game, and that's, of course, Echoes, Shadows of Valentia. So I hope you can see them. These are the 3 enamel pins in the style of pixel art for the 2 main characters in the game, called Alm and Celica.
The dual protagonists, Alm and Celica, will join others locked in a tragic war dividing the continent of Valentia, which the developers have recreated from the ground up.
And the third one is Marth. They look okay, but as you know, I've got quite a collection of enamel pins and some really outstanding ones, and I wouldn't say these ones would rock the boat. But the rest of the contents is really nice. So the game itself, just in the standard edition, and just to clarify, I always have the Australian version, because that's the one that is sold here at retail in New Zealand. And in fact, I checked, you can still get Fire Emblem Echoes at a reasonable price at some retailers, both here in New Zealand, but I checked also overseas, like on Amazon, for example. If you like your games physical, and I always think the Nintendo DS and 3DS in particular with their cartridges are really well suited for playing them physically, then this is one you can still get without too much trouble and expense. Sound selection, it's quite a generous one. They offer both the classic version and the new Echoes version, and I'll explain that. Echoes is not a new game. It came out in 2017, but is in fact a remake of a much older Fire Emblem game called simply Gaiden, and that came out in 1992 in Japan. And this is therefore the first time it was made available, localized for the West in 2017. Here's the art book for Valentia, and it is gorgeous. It's really beautiful. There's not a lot of pages. Look, they all signed at the back of the book. Now, there are some very nice character illustrations, of course, as you'd expect in an art book. But what I really find super interesting in this book are the illustrations for the interiors and the castle designs. A look at the detail of the different classes and mounts and weapons. They poured so much love and attention to detail into this. The Ramparts of a regal castle. And I will talk about Ramparts in a moment. Very important. I have seen this limited edition listed on a variety of sites. It's still available and not too expensive for a nice limited edition. I hope you can see it on the back. It says the way of the sword or the way of the heart. And that shows very clearly that there are 2 different paths for our protagonists. So, it being a much older game, I had expected that it might be a bit simple, both in presentation and possibly also in gameplay finesse. Boy, was I mistaken. This is a textbook remake. The game looks out of this world gorgeous, and the gameplay is some of the best I have had in Fire Emblem as a whole. I am completely in love with this game and besotted with it. There are many reasons why I like it. One is that the dual story path for Arm and Celica is reflected in the gameplay. It's a simple but very effective structure. Each one has their own path to make across the continent. Eventually, right at the end, they meet up, but you're playing alternately as Arm with his troops and then as Celica with hers,
as they lead their armies on separate yet parallel paths in an attempt to quell the conflict.
You know what? It never gets boring. You've got to have your wits about you. You switch from one to the other. It's just wonderful. I loved that aspect of it. I gained a really, really deep appreciation for what the people produced back in the early 1990s with these games. This game rocks. I told you before, I'm deeply into the maps with Fire Emblem and I replay a lot of them. To me, these are some of the best maps I have ever encountered. There was no map where I ever thought, this is getting a bit tedious, I just want to get through it, you know. There's always the odd one like that. Usually you would expect that. I didn't have one of those in this game. It's very straightforward gameplay. There aren't a lot of gimmicks or anything, but by golly, the design behind them is so astute. The way they balanced everything, these programmers, it's just astonishing, really. And to give you just one example, I want to talk about the Ramparts, because there is one castle, and I have gone back and tried to find which one it was, and I couldn't figure it out, where the map, it seemed so obvious when you look at it, you know, narrow corridors to get in, and then only the ramparts on each side of the castle with the flying units protecting them, and you could see where it would get really knotty to get in and then overcome the opposition. And I played the map. I probably didn't do very well the first time and lost some units. And I'm not on permadeath. No, I just don't. I'm 72. I can live without that stress. I thought, need to play it again. I often replay maps 2-3 times easily. As I replayed this map, I realised how incredibly cunning they had been. It looked like it should be straightforward, but it wasn't, and it took me several attempts just to figure out how does this map really tick, because you had to somehow also disable the flying units, because otherwise you were just overwhelmed, and you needed to get one set of combatants to the back of the castle. And anyway, I did manage to complete the map in what I regarded was an optimal fashion. You know, you don't lose anyone and you get exactly the result you wanted, and it didn't take too many turns. Everything was just right, just tickety-boo, you know, perfect result. How many times do you think I replayed that map? 5 times? 10 times? 21. I replayed it 21 times. Okay, I got the perfect result before 21, and then, of course, I had to go back just to check that I really had got the perfect result. But, yeah, I remember that. It was such a weird figure, and I'd never done that before. And I never once got bored. That probably tells you as much about my game-playing personality as it does about Fire Emblem, Echoes, and its maps. Just extraordinary. The other really nice feature about Echoes is that they've got practically every line voice acted. And you know what that does to lift a game, especially if the voice acting is good. Plus, they've done an orchestral score for it. It's a wonderful buffet, that game. Are there any reasons why you might not like the game? as a Fire Emblem aficionado? Yes, quite possibly. Because going back to the old game and being very faithful to it, Fire Emblem Echoes does not have the weapons triangle. Now, if you are particularly fond of that mechanic, then this might come as a bit of a shock. I don't know how you'd find this system. In Echoes, terrain and positioning become a lot more important, even more important than in other Fire Emblem games. You get skills by fighting and using particular weapons.
Powerful combat arts. Types of combat arts vary, from powerful attacks to special abilities.
This is a gameplay element that I have always liked, and I always do well with it. It seems to suit me. For me, that was no hindrance at all. I'm fine with the weapons triangle, but if it's not there, you get a different system like this one, I'm also good with it. It's still essentially, at its foundation, a Fire Emblem game. There are quite a few differences in how weapons are handled in Echoes, so I won't go into too much detail here, especially since I don't have footage to demonstrate those features to you. But I think the system works well. I would call it just like the story and the rest of the gameplay. Everything is very straightforward, and I found it, that usual phrase, easy to pick up but hard to master. To my mind, that is always a highly desirable aspect. So each of the 3 Fire Emblem games has an extra feature. For Fire Emblem Fates, it's the My Castle feature. With Awakening, it was the side maps, but also the many other new features they brought in, like, the revamped relationship romance angle. And in Echoes, they brought back a feature that was in the original Gaiden game, which is real-time dungeons with exploration for both loot and enemies.
Sometimes you'll encounter dungeons. Infiltrate one to roam free, smash through obstacles, and find items. It's best to prepare for the worst.
I found they were a great addition, but like any good thing, I would say use in moderation. If you do too much, it can, of course, become a bit repetitive, and that would induce tedium. But, of course, they are a bit addictive, especially since there's always some bonus to be had. So finding the right balance, I think, is really key here. So here are our 2 protagonists, and Celica. So what do these 2 amiibo do in game?
Tap one of these amiibo to challenge a special dungeon. Or tap them during a battle to trade a bit of health for an illusory doppelganger for 1 turn.
I remember I have used that particular mechanic a few times.
By tapping a compatible amiibo into the game, you can summon other illusory allies as well.
So there you have it, my recollection of the 3 Fire Emblem games for the 3DS. I had to rummage around a bit in my memory because obviously a lot of the gameplay is now years ago, but I am left with an overwhelming sense of appreciation for these games and what they achieved on the 3DS. And the problem is, the moment I start talking about them, I feel like, maybe I would like to pick up one of these games and replay it. That's the nature of truly great games, I think. In closing, I just would like to talk about an aspect of gaming that applies not just to Fire Emblem, but across the board. But of course, with games where you become especially deeply involved, the question often arises, and so many people have asked me, Britta, do you have a favourite character for this or that game? And over the years, I have always, I think consistently said, I don't really develop a sort of exclusive, overweening attachment to just one character. That just doesn't really happen with me. Obviously, I do have favourites, and as you progress through the game, you go through different stages, and I find sometimes my affection transfers from one to another, etc. I think that's only natural, but I don't actually think it's particularly healthy to become fixated on or even obsessed with just one character. We sometimes see how that plays out online in particular, and I don't think it's good for any player's mental health, really. I think this plate design demonstrates this really nicely, because we have two different families, two different factions, with two sets of intriguing and fascinating characters. But what makes the whole game tick, any game, but I find with JRPGs in particular, because I mentioned the two pillars before, is the whole team, the dynamic between a cast of characters who form a tightly woven family and friendship unit. If that balance isn't there, if that doesn't work, then no individual character can truly shine either. That is my strong belief. Now, I became quite attached to one particular female character, and that is Elise with the big corkscrew curls. And I think the reason for that was that she is such a vivacious and sometimes naughty character. She was such a contrast to the others who were often extremely serious, and some of them, let's face it, are a bit po-faced. So I always enjoyed her antics. She always brought a bit of levity and laughter to the situation, and I liked her for that. Yes, so in that sense, she is a favourite, you could say. But all this wouldn't work without the family dynamics in Nohr. And without that aspect, we wouldn't have the synergy between the cast and how they play out on the battlefield. Because after all, your relationship with these people also has a significant effect in combat.
Hoshido and the glory of Nohr. At the epicenter of this conflict stands a young royal named Corrin. Will the prince side with the family that raised him in Nohr, or his true bloodline in Hoshido? Whatever he decides, he may soon find that his greatest strength lies not in the weapons he holds, but in the bonds he builds. By pairing up two units in battle, it will strengthen their relationship, creating new ways to interact with them at their home base. When the relationship levels of two units reach a certain point, they'll be able to engage in a support conversation. This, in turn, will increase their support level. To reach level S, two units must fall in love and marry. In many cases, they'll have a child, which will grow up in the deep realms, where time flows at a faster rate.
In closing, I would say I probably tend more towards a holistic view, if you can put it like that, rather than picking out just one character without considering how they fit into the whole scheme. And I've said the same thing previously when I've talked about a game like, for example, Persona 4 Golden, where I also feel that is very strongly the case. Glory be to Fire Emblem. I hope forever. There aren't many game series that I love this much, and Fire Emblem is definitely among the greats for me. As always, thank you for your time. Please keep well. I'm Food for Dogs. Bye-bye.